Welcome to Chapter 3. This chapter is going to talk about workers' compensation. And we're going to talk about the various issues or problems associated with compensation for psychological conditions and occupational illnesses, and describe some assessment methods from WCB. Now, workers' compensation started in Canada in 1914, as you can see, and it was set up so that even if you work for an employer who was not financially stable, you would still get coverage for the injury that has occurred. And so it's insurance is what it is. There's a no fault system. So again, there would be the tendency to blame the employee. And I suppose to a degree, you could always say there may always be a reason for that, or quite often. And it's intended to be, you can't appeal this to the courts. So whatever the workers' compensation determination is, that's basically a closed process. You can ensure that the worker receives the first aid treatment, benefits while recuperating at home, proper treatment for the injuries, physiotherapy, rehab, things along this line, depending obviously what the injury is. And make sure that the injured worker will receive payment while off work. The medical bills will be paid. And a pension if disabled, so that if somebody becomes disabled, that they will still get a pension. And also, if there's a reduction in their income or earning power after the injury or because of the injury, the person will get compensated for the difference. So if somebody becomes immobilized and they make less money than they did before, that gap will be addressed. Make sure that in this particular case, there are different conditions for employees, subcontractors, etc., and a system that can pay the benefits if the worker isn't affected by an industrial disease. So it's a respiratory disease or something along that line. Manitoba has inclusion of post-traumatic stress disorder, or some places now calling it PPSS for post-traumatic stress syndrome. And generally, you get about 90% of your net earnings, or at least some of the jurisdictions. And other jurisdictions have a percentage of your average earnings. So there'll be a slight reduction in your net pay. So obviously economic loss is a wage reduction or wage loss. And non-economic would be for things like if you hurt your back, not being able to play with your grandchildren, things along that line, or lift boxes when you're at home. So in this particular case, the loss, if there's less than full functional capabilities, is dexterity, like limit the ability or dexterity of the injury causes a limitation. And also, again, no longer able to perform some duties such as lifting, twisting, bending, etc. So to provide, the two main goals you can see are to provide services to prevent injuries or reduce psychological impact, which we'll talk about in an upcoming chapter, providing training and development to prepare the person to go back into the workplace. And in this particular case, you have unlimited medical aid for things like if you need a prosthesis, a fund to encourage re-employment, because a lot of times these people are still quite capable of doing something. It may be a minor setback or limitation, or it could be very major depending on the particular job, especially if you're doing literally heavy lifting. So here are some of the tables. Secondary injuries, you can see that for the reemployment of disabled workers, if there's multiple injuries, and you can perhaps consider discrimination against the workers with a disability. And you can see that the additional injury could make the employer responsible for a far more serious disability than if the worker had not had the prior injury. So those are some of the factors under workers' compensation. Some social goals: rehabilitation, vocational. So there, a lot of these people who do get hurt and maybe not able to do what they did before, they can still do something. If they had a very physical job, maybe they can go work in an office, or maybe they'll learn some IT skills, or HR, or accounting, things along this line that are less physically demanding and more mental. Again, physical rehabilitation so that a person can get their range of motion back. Simple things like the ability to walk, so ambulatory, the ability to, just strength, etc. And again, coping with what we call the activities of daily life, personal hygiene, cooking, cleaning, money management. All of these types of things may have been affected by, if there's cognitive or sociological impacts. The person may have a disfigurement, so they may have concerns about that, how they feel. Or if they've lost a limb, they may feel very they won't be at ease if they've now perhaps got a scar, or if they walk with a limp, things along this line. It can be very psychologically hard for people after they've had an injury. You can also have cancers, skin diseases. There can also be a latency period, so there can be a lag between the exposure and the development of the disease, and this can sometimes be quite long. You have the physical injuries leading to a mental disability, which is what I was just talking about, where you have lost a hand or something along this line. And then again, there's the mental aspect of that. I worked with a gentleman, in fact I still work with him, and he lost his right arm, fairly high up on the arm, and he was right-handed. So he works in IT, so he has to do everything with one hand, which is he's obviously adapted to that, but I don't think he it's not something he would have wanted to have happen. All right. The physical trauma, sometimes there could be a chronic pain, the mental stress of the mental condition. So yes. So anyways, the employers are divided into 3 categories. As you can see, there's an incidental fund. There's also individual liabilities, and certain low-risk industries excluded under various acts across the country, which is a minor point. So in this particular case, workers' compensation, you can see as a percentage of payroll. In Manitoba, it was $1.30. It actually went down in 2016. Alberta went up. Newfoundland went down. You can see the various amounts. You can see Manitoba tends to be on the lower end of the spectrum compared to some other jurisdictions. Manitoba doesn't tend to have a lot of heavy industry, and so that may be part of the factor, or maybe just employers in Manitoba are more diligent than perhaps some of the other areas. And there's of course the good old economies of scale factor, that Manitoba being a larger province and Prince Edward Island would affect that. But you also see Ontario is quite high, where there is a lot of manufacturing, and Quebec is also quite a bit higher. You would also need to make sure that you record and calculate the injury frequency rates. So you simply, here's the formula. You take the number of injuries and you divide it by the total hours. You multiply it by 200,000 as per expressed as a ratio of 200,000. And you can see some figures use 1 million. So it gives you an indication of how your frequency compared to the overall average. So if you have a small organization, 2 injuries might be a lot. If you have a very large organization, 17 injuries might be actually fairly small. So your insurance premiums are based on the experience. So it's sort of like driving a car. There's a general pricing, but if you have a tendency to speed, if you have a tendency to be careless and are in accidents on a more frequent basis, then you will eventually literally pay the price for that out of your pocket. And firms that are lower than average will get breaks on their workers' compensation. And obviously, employers that don't spend the time and effort in training and allow their employees to continue to do unsafe practices will pay higher premiums. And so there is a financial incentive for firms to have a safe workplace outside of the human aspect of it. You have reporting requirements. You need to state the nature of employment, whether it's perhaps a contract employee or a regular full-time employee, etc., the person's income level, the nature of the incident and injury, any time loss and treatment, all of this must be recorded. So you need to have this reported. All right, non-compliance, penalties and fines will be applied. Employers could pay up to $50,000, and they don't have to go. WCB doesn't have to take you to court. They can just fine you, and you basically have no appeal process or very little appeal process. So here's just some discussion questions at the end. And that's the end of chapter number 3.